One of the other things that we'll be doing while we're trying to reach out and help people through these online resources is Gary. One thing is that Gary will be presenting with us with a video tutorial on how to make communion bread. So if you find yourselves at home, it's really a very easy process. It's not hard to do, and Gary's going to show us that even a man can do it. So we can make communion bread so that we can still observe the Lord's Supper at home. The church has resources available. If you're not able to do those things, if you need the juice or if you need bread, we can certainly provide those for you. But if you're able to make it at home, it might be something you can do there. We also will have a portion of a tutorial on how to access some of the online resources that we'll have. Obviously, if you're watching this, you found at least one of the online resources, but there are other things available for you to be able to use as well through the church website. And Michael will be taking us through that. We also will be posting some resources that are usable for our Bible class study times, and those will be discussions between either me and Gary or me and Michael, or Michael and Don or whoever is taking the topic for those times. And those videos will serve as sort of a kickoff for maybe some small group discussions if you're able to get together with another family or two, or just among your own family. And you can use those as discussion starters, if you will. We also will be posting some videos similar to this, more sermon-like content, where we will present some lessons for you for your own spiritual growth. And then there also will be some songs posted, some song services that are posted either for your edification or for you to sing along with. And then, as always, we want you to reach out to the church with any type of prayer requests or other type of requests that you might have, especially along the nature of spiritual matters, so that the elders can either be in contact with you or can pray with you or pray for you as you have those needs. So please, even though we're physically distant from one another, let's not be spiritually distant from one another. Let's continue to rely on one another through this time.
Good evening. We will be doing a short tutorial on how to access the live stream through the church website. First, you will start by going and typing in mcphersonscoc.org and hitting enter, and it will take you to our main page here. It is your choice whether you would like to log in or not, but to access this information, you do not need to be logged in. Here on the menu tab, you will click on the Resources button. And then the very first option under it is Resources during meeting cancellation. Go ahead and click on that. After the opening paragraph, right down below is a link that says click here for live stream of worship service. So go ahead and click on that. And when we are live, like we are right now, it will show the video playing in this window. Right now it says live stream offline because I am pre-recording this, but the video will be showing it. Down here will be the updated title for whichever video is being live streamed. For instance, tonight will be Wednesday evening study 3/18/2020. So you will see the correct title, and you will be watching the video live with other members of the congregation. If you go back to the meeting cancellation resources, down below we will be posting links after the video is live streamed directly to the videos that they will be saved to YouTube. If you are unable to watch the live stream while we are live, or just want to watch it again to catch something that you may have missed, these links will be provided here so that you can watch them at your convenience. If you have any other questions, please contact Michael through email, his phone number, or you may call the church at this number up above. Please stay tuned as we have Gary showing us how to make communion bread in your home, and we will finish up with Jason giving us a devotional thought.
We're going to make some small individual pieces of communion bread. We're going to begin with about half a cup of flour. Then we're going to mix in olive oil. You can also use shortening for this. Some recipes recommend poking little holes with the fork. I'm going to put these in an oven that's preheated to 375. And we'll come back and check on them in about 15 minutes. We're going to check these after about 15 minutes. They look just fine, and now we have communion bread. If I can do it, anybody can do it. If you would like to pick up communion supplies at the church building, we have frozen grape juice into old ice trays and placed them in small Ziploc bags. We have also taken prepackaged individual pieces of communion bread and placed those into small Ziploc bags. And you're welcome to come by the building and pick those up if that works better for you.
Good evening, and this is different. Hope that you are doing well at home, and hope that through this time of just strange happenings in our society that you are able to find some good in some things. And that's really what we're going to try to talk about over the next few weeks as we put some class material together. And as I introduce this topic for tonight, for this Wednesday night devotional time, this will serve as kind of a springboard for what our Sunday morning class discussions will be over the next several weeks as we deal with this this time of quarantine and this time of not being able to gather together in large groups and those kind of things. So as I was reflecting about how to just how to do this, how to talk to people about the things that are going on and how to make a relevant Bible study out of that, it really struck me that we're kind of experiencing a time in the wilderness. And that idea of being in the wilderness is what we'll focus on for the next few weeks as we look at some Bible class material. So I just want to introduce that topic for tonight and talk about some things that the Bible tells us about being in the wilderness and how we can be God's people who are experiencing life in the wilderness. So really think about the things that are going on in our society today. You know, we're seeing a reality that really hasn't come around very often, certainly not very often in our lifetimes, but even as we look back over history, there are just very few times that we can look at where things are going the way that they're going right now. I did hear one person say that his mother had compared this to a little bit of the way people reacted to the polio virus back in the early 1950s. And as we are experiencing this idea of social distancing and staying away from people and quarantine and being scared of a virus that's out there, I can understand how back then, as the polio virus was devastating people's lives, that it may have been very similar to what we're experiencing today. As far as numbers of people that are being affected, another example that's been brought out is the Spanish flu virus of 1918 and 1919, and the numbers of people that were infected and the number of people that were quarantined and things like that. So, you know, this is not unprecedented necessarily from the standpoint of this has just never happened before, but it's really maybe something that just hasn't happened in the lifetime of a lot of us that are alive today and dealing with this. So, first of all, we just should take comfort that other generations have dealt with these things, and they have obviously we have survived to this point, and I think that we will survive this, and that we will move on as a society from this point forward. And what that's going to look like, we don't know, and how long this is going to take, we don't know, but there are things that we can be reassured about. So one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about in the news today is the idea of social distancing. And that really is the most effective way to stop the spread of this virus that's going around. You know, if you stay away from people that have the virus, then you won't get the virus. And if you do have the virus and you stay away from other people, then you won't spread it on to others. So this idea of social distancing is something that we are hearing a lot about, and it can be very effective. But it's hard because social distancing is, though it's a phrase that's come to be a part of our common language, it's really hard to do in a practical sense because we all still need groceries. We all still need to go to the doctor's office. We might need to go to the post office or just to other places where we're going to come into contact with other people. And so from a very practical standpoint, social distancing is a hard thing to do. But it's also hard from the standpoint of that's not who God created us to be. God didn't create us to be isolated individuals. He created us to be social people. And he instilled within us a certain needs and certain desires that can only be met within the context of social relationships. And even to some extent, God expects us to be involved in social relationships. He expects us to assemble as a group. He expects us to share this common experience with one another. And so that becomes very difficult as a matter of for us to do as people of faith, that we're all of a sudden isolated and distant from one another. So that's really what got me thinking in the idea of this being a time in the wilderness for us. You know, thinking about the wilderness, it's getting away from society, it's getting away from people that are in large groups and things. And so as God's people, we really are in a very real way experiencing a time in the wilderness. So how do we, as God's people, as his assembly, as his church, how do we function during a time when social distancing has become a necessity? And so I want to look just for a few minutes tonight at some examples from the scriptures about how God's people dealt with being in the wilderness. And so the first scripture I want to look at is Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 6. Exodus 19, verses 1 through 6. It says, "In the third month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. And there Israel camped in front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So the first thing that I want us to notice from this is that as the children of Israel left Egyptian captivity, that God purposefully and intentionally took them out into the wilderness. He took them to a place that was isolated, that was away from other nations, that was away from the captivity that they had known. And he took them there for the very purpose of drawing him closer to himself. It was there in the wilderness that God introduced himself to the people as a nation. And it was in the wilderness that the people really began to learn who God was. So God called his people out there for the very purpose to establish a covenant relationship with them. And it was in the wilderness that the people learned how to be his people. And so even though we find ourselves in the wilderness today, there is much to be said for being in the wilderness. It's in the wilderness that we can learn to be God's people in a very real sense. Another passage that I want us to look at is in 1 Kings chapter 19. Is a little story from the life of Elijah the prophet. In 1 Kings chapter 18 is Elijah's great victory over the prophets of Baal. And he had gathered there on Mount Carmel and had did the big sacrifice that you'll remember well, where he gave them the opportunity to call on Baal to call down fire to burn up the sacrifice. And of course, Baal didn't answer, and their sacrifice was left on the altar. And then Elijah did the thing where he poured the water around, and he poured the water on top of the altar and all of those things. And then he prayed to God, and the fire from heaven came down, and it licked up the sacrifice and the stones and the water and everything else. And so God demonstrated himself to be there in a very real, very spectacular sense. But shortly after that, Queen Jezebel, threatens Elijah's life, and she basically puts a hit out on him where she's ready to go and take his life, and she wants him to die. And so Elijah flees. And in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 3, it says, "And he was afraid," that is, Elijah was afraid, "and he rose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree." And so Elijah, after experiencing this great victory, after just really seeing God show up in a very spectacular way, purposefully removed himself and went out into the wilderness because he was afraid. He was afraid of Jezebel and her threats. And eventually Elijah ends up taking a 40-day journey down to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, it's called. And it's there that Elijah comes face to face with God, and he meets him there again in a very real sense, where God shows up and talks to Elijah. And so even after a great victory, Elijah finds himself in the wilderness, but it's in the wilderness that he finds new purpose. He finds new direction. He finds new meaning, because God takes that opportunity to instruct him on what he needs to do to continue to be faithful to God. And so even though Elijah finds himself alone, very alone in the wilderness, it's there that he finds new direction and new purpose. And so as we find ourselves going through a time of social distancing, a time when we're not able to do the things we wish we could or that we are accustomed to doing, it's perhaps in these moments that we can find new direction. We can find new purpose, and we can find a way to honor God and to be faithful to him in ways that we had never imagined would be possible before that. And so there's a great lesson for us from the life of Elijah. Think also of the wilderness as it's presented in Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, we have the prediction from the angel Gabriel that John is going to be born to Elizabeth and Zacharias, and some very specific things are said about who John would be. And if you look at Luke chapter 1, verses 13 through 17, here's the angel speaking. Says, "The angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid, Zacharias, for your petition has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will give him the name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord, and he will drink no wine or liquor, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit while he is yet in his mother's womb. And he will turn back many of the sons of Israel to the Lord their God. And it is he who will go as a forerunner before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteous, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." And so it is prophesied, it's told by the angel, that John would be like the prophet Elijah. And as we just mentioned, Elijah spent some time in the wilderness. He spent time in the wilderness getting new direction and gaining new perspective so that he could be faithful to God. And look at the very last verse of Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, speaking about John after his birth, says, "The child continued to grow and to become strong in spirit, and he lived in the deserts until the day of his public appearance in Israel." Where did he live? He lived in the desert. He lived in the wilderness. And he stayed in that place because it was there that he was preparing himself for the role that God had set before him. That is to be Elijah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, the voice of one who was preparing the way for the Lord. And so here again, we have an example of the wilderness being used as a time of preparation and a time of setting aside people for God's service. So as we think about our time in the wilderness right now, what opportunities is God placing before us to be faithful to him and to go out and to witness to other people on his behalf? And our final example that we'll look at is in Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry." And so Jesus went to the wilderness. He went to the wilderness because he knew that a time of temptation, a time of difficulty was coming. And it was during those 40 days of fasting and praying in the desert that he was able to prepare himself for the temptation that was coming before him. And so again, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the end of this time of social distancing is going to be. We don't know what the end of this virus outbreak is going to be. But we can do one thing while we are going into the wilderness, as we are spending time in this social distancing, we can prepare ourselves for whatever comes. If it's a future that we are hopeful doesn't come, if it's a time of difficulty and a time of dismay and where things get worse rather than better, then we need to use this time preparing for that spiritually. But maybe it's a time where things get back to normal and things get back to kind of life as we know it, or life as we're used to seeing. Well, then this still is a time of preparation. This still is a time for us to prepare for how we're going to be God's people in a new future going forward. And so we just want to be people who are the people that God has called us to be. We want to be people who are using the time that God has given us to prepare ourselves for the life that God has called us to live. And that is to be his witnesses, his people in this world, regardless of what this world looks like or regardless of what this world is experiencing. So in each of these examples that we've looked at, the wilderness sort of serves as a place where God can be found in a very significant way. And he is there now. He's with us in the wilderness as we are being led down this path that none of us would have imagined, none of us would have chosen. Yet here we are. And if there's one thing we can be certain of, we can be certain of the fact that God is with us. So I hope that as you are experiencing these uncertain times, that you're able to reflect upon how God is going to bless us through these and how God is going to use us as his people during this time of difficulty. We'll be continuing the study over the next few weeks. As a Sunday morning Bible class, we'll look at some other topics. For instance, we will look at the idea of wandering but not lost. So we are in a time of wandering, just as the children of Israel were in the Old Testament. And though they were wandering, they were never lost because God was always with them. We'll also look at helping kids navigate the wilderness. You know, how do we talk to our kids about the things that we're experiencing today, and how do we give them surety in a time of discontent, in a time of difficulty like we're experiencing right now. We'll also talk about growing in the wilderness, and we'll talk about personal Bible study. And then we'll also talk about leading the lost through the wilderness. So how can we still effectively work on the mission statement that we've been talking about so much recently with being planters and waterers, being people who go out and try to show the love of God to the people around us. So those are some things that we have in store for our Bible study time over the next few weeks. And I hope that you will take the advantage of the opportunity that you have to be able to grow during this time in the wilderness.
Hello everyone, this is Michael talking to you live. While I was making this video, I did not know a change that we had made. We will be live again on Sunday the 22nd, but it will not be at 9:30. It will be at 10:30. We will start with worship, and Bible study will follow. The bulletins that have either been emailed or mailed through the postal service to you will have that information on the back side of it, just to give you another reminder. But instead of starting at 9:30 on Sunday, we will start at 10:30. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope that you guys have a good week. Remember to pray for one another, pray for our country, and stay safe.